All right, hello everybody. This is Matt from the But Why Though podcast, and today I'm here with Brice, a PhD student from the University of Texas, and we're going to be talking about uncontacted tribes. So let's go ahead. Brice, how you doing?
Sure, I'm pretty good.
And before we get started, Brice, can we get a little bit of information about you, and I guess why are you interested in this topic?
I'm a grad student in the Religious Studies Department at the University of Texas in Austin. And interest is mostly just it's one of the cooler topics in anthropology. Kind of difficult to actually study for the obvious reason that they're uncontacted people, but it's a really cool topic. So talking about it is always fun.
Awesome. He's also probably one of the smartest people I ever know with random knowledge.
Yeah,
if you ever need him,
useful, the better.
Yes. That's not a bad thing. So we're going to start out with giving a little bit of background about, I guess, these, as we call it, uncontacted tribe, per se, is what we're going to call them for this podcast, but I guess we'll see what they are. So estimated in about 2013, there's around 100 or so not known, because obviously if we haven't found them, then we don't know if they exist. Uncontacted tribe, most of them found in New Guinea and the Amazonia, basically throughout Brazil. Thought you had a thought. Sorry.
Oh yeah. New Guinea, Amazon. There used to be some other people who hadn't been contacted in places like Australia and in like mainland India, but I think all of them wound up getting pulled into the larger society some point in like the 1970s, 80s.
I believe it. Brazil is said to basically identified about 77 of these tribes. So like I said, there's about 100 or so. Like I said, outdated information. I don't think people are really going around trying to find them. I'm sure they are, but not. While we call them uncontacted, most have had at least some form of exposure to the outside world, whether it be indirect by accident, like they ran into a tourist, they trade with goods. Sometimes they basically, as they see people, forms of scientists and other sorts, they kind of make little trades, or essentially they just happen to run into them. As in,
if you look at the Wikipedia article, for uncontacted tribes, the first thing that shows up is a picture of some folks, like it's a picture from an airplane or a drone or something, and it's two guys looking up at the airplane like, what the? They're very scared.
But yeah, so there's very, very actually few that have been like actually completely have no exposure to the outside world. It's also been said that at least most of them in the Amazon tend to avoid contact, and they're actually kind of known as like voluntarily isolated tribes now. And it's obviously from unpleasant encounters in the past, such as violence, destruction of their land, they've been sick, any sorts of like things like that. And probably the main example I have is from this, hopefully you might be able to explain more, Macho Piro tribe, which apparently in 1894 was slaughtered by outsiders and retreated deep into the forest.
Yeah, it was the, this is an example of my useless knowledge. There's a Werner Herzog movie called Fitzcarraldo about a crazy guy who tries to have a steamship dragged up a mountain in Peru. Well, he got the name from an actual guy who was a rubber baron, and he's the guy who killed all of those indigenous people with his own private army. So
that is a very but it was a rubber company, which is why it's funny.
But I guess the thing is it was just kind of like piggybacking on that. A lot of those tribes, they may not have actually existed for that long, because in a lot of cases they are made up of people who had probably survived earlier waves of colonization and then fled deeper and deeper into remote like jungle areas and become new groups. So
yeah. So Another one, basically, as we were talking about that, kind of the most recent one. I don't know if anybody's heard out there this one, but basically in 2017, they're now investigating of murdering of people from a tribe in Brazil by gold miners, and that was in this year, I believe, earlier August, I believe, or so of this year.
Yeah, the gold mining, logging. There's kind of like people I know who know more about Brazil have mentioned this, the kind of like Wild West atmosphere in the Amazon region in the kind of like the last decade, because there's all this mining, all this logging. There's a lot of money to be made. So people go in and they try to remove the people who are living in wherever they're going into. So
yeah, unfortunately, that happens quite a bit, probably more than it should out of all things. So like we were talking about how they're basically getting, unfortunately, I guess, murdered or slaughtered in some cases, these tribes face a lot of problems that may not even actually involve that. But, I mean, just basically speaking for those, basically, they need constant government protection, apparently. Brazil funds a lot of money into this because, obviously, they're illegally killed. They have their land either stolen, as you said, plowed, bulldozed, mined. And so basically, if the government doesn't have the money, they run out of money to protect it, funding, and then basically, as you said, the Wild West nature. They also have very low genetic diversity. So basically, this means they're very susceptible to diseases.
yeah,
And they're pretty bad to where I've read some of the reports they're talking about where they basically like they happen to run into a tourist, the tourist like breathes on them and just like waves like, hey, or even a handshake, and it like ends up decimating the tribes where the government has to come out with like loads of medicine to try to save them.
yeah. I think the Brazilian agency that's in charge of their indigenous population as a whole, but especially protecting these uncontacted people, I think it's the only kind of contact they really allow is people going in to distribute vaccines or medicine for that purpose. So
also funny, like, because basically we take that here, like, I guess in America and other like more modernized places like that is like a given. But these people, you know, you shake hands with somebody you've never met and you could pretty much kill your entire family off. It's crazy to think about.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate, but it is like pretty insane to think.
Black humor.
Yes. They also basically they have very small populations, obviously, because there's just not that many of them due to this like being successful, this warlike mentality, basically being murdered. So they have these very small populations. They're usually inbred populations, so they don't have that great of genetic diversity. So they have a lot of problems already, and they're apparently very warlike cultures, causing basically these like the old style of attack, revenge attacks, which basically kills a lot of the population sizes and never lets them actually grow.
Yeah, like I've read there's a lot of stuff that's been written about that specifically because people have debated how warlike are these people really? Are they really violent? Are they not really that violent? Is some of the violence caused by the interaction with anthropologists? There was a guy in the 80s, Napoleon Chagnon, who was researching people in Brazil, and he recorded this film that a lot of people wind up watching in like school called The Axe Fight, which was of an axe fight that happened with the people he was working with, and he filmed this fight unfold. But people accused him of having traded the axes and machetes that were used in the fight to the people in the tribe, which increased like individual like jealousy of people who didn't have the new tools to the people who got them, and so like provoked more violence. And they said, you know, this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been there. Their argument. So
that's quite interesting. Because I know they do been traded a lot for metal tools, so I can totally see like obviously like machetes and axes are bad, but they're also very useful in the jungle for very other things. So I can see. Yeah, I guess that is weird. Even jealousy in the simplest forms can lead to bad things, which also kind of leads to the last part of one of the major problems that we have, and you kind of touched on it too, is basic communications and interactions with people. Like nobody knows their language. Just the language barrier, communication barrier, it's huge. Just even like you said, planes might fly up with scientists coming out just to say hi and try to help these people, and they might start shooting arrows at them because they have no idea.
Like that seems like it's a pretty logical response to complete like bizarre people showing up in some weird flying thing. It's acting on the safe side.
This is true. So the main thing I want to get in here, because that was basically our background of like like kind of what they are. I want to get in here and discuss some of the fascinations on real, I guess, meat of like why we really want to talk about this. And I guess the first thing I want to hit on is I find it fascinating that we've mapped basically parts of the universe. We've been to the moon. We found planets. We have telescopes years away, but we actually have people on Earth that we are even unaware of their existence. And considering how social media works and we're so interconnected and every day, like you and I right now, I believe you were in another state. Am I correct?
Yeah, I'm in Georgia. Yeah.
Yes, for Georgia. And I'm in Texas right now. And we're having this communication where I can actually see you. Yet there are people that live on this planet that we've never even know existed.
I mean, like, it's like the thing that's like fascinating to me about that is just like how normal that was until really, really recently. Like, not being able to interact with anybody outside your own like village or small community was just the norm for humans for thousands and thousands of years. And our society has changed dramatically just in like the last 30 years in terms of how easily we can connect to people. So
that's true, because even we're looking almost even as early as the 1900s, 1930s, we're still having problems connecting with people.
Yeah. And like even before that, like people have always like done like stuff like trading, like traveling back and forth between different regions, but that wasn't the majority of people at any time. Most people, like, I mean, even today, most people I think like still live within like 20 miles of their birthplace their whole life. But you get people who are still living in a really like, early kind of, they have like a very simple technology and simple like social structure, relatively speaking. Like that's just been the norm for a long time for them. And so like, I can see sort of why people in these voluntarily isolated tribes wouldn't really be like champing at the bit to go meet strange outsiders.
That's for sure. So I guess based off of that, is this something you think you could ever imagine doing? Because I know you're talking about it's relatively new. Do you think you could ever live in like one of these isolated tribes? Or if like, I guess if you lived back then, do you think you would have a problem considering what you know now of how your life is?
I mean, that's hard to say. Like people have talked about like, what's it called? Dunbar's number? Is that what it is? The idea there's like a limited number of people you can actually really know at any given time. And it's about the size of some of these kinds of groups. It's like 150 people or something. Like I think if that's what's normal for you, it's probably not so tough. But on the other hand, like people have always kind of like, there have always been people who are sort of like outsiders to their communities or like got into arguments with other people or all sorts of things. So, like and none of these like groups are like they're by no means like idyllic kind of like internal in-looking communities. But I think if I had like been alive back then, living in such a small group would probably not seem so strange. I could not do that today, though. No.
Yeah, it's just funny you talking about that, and I think like Kate, the other host of But Why Though, basically lives half her day on Twitter, and I'm like, I don't think she could make it where she couldn't have a phone on her at certain times for even like a day or two, let alone try to have to live off the land. Which I guess is interesting as well, is basically these people have survived so long and they haven't had any problems. I mean, they've had their problems, but they've been able to survive like centuries without actually advancing so much in technology, I guess, to even the modern medicine or even to metal tools per se, without trading.
People get really good at that. It's just, I mean, my impression from other examples that I know of. people talk about how like there's people who were like quote unquote primitive technology, but what they have turns out to be really well adapted to the place they live. They've had a lot of time to figure out the right ways to sort of, you know, live in the place that they do, which doesn't mean they can't benefit from things like medicine or other kinds of technology. But in the absence of like having the right conditions to develop those, they're pretty well adapted to use what they've got in the place they live. So like the, you know, like they're just like, you can do a lot with very simple technology if that's all you've got going for you at the time.
So I guess that comes with that. Do you think those people, given what they know and how advanced they are with their simple technology, would be, I don't know if necessarily advanced would be the word, or more, I guess, educated wise than, I guess, your average adult now that basically has to rely on Google and a smartphone to do pretty much anything?
That's a hard question.
Because like one person has medicine and can Google and stuff and find, you know, thousands of technology or like you know, like like history and notes on anything they want to know, but in a real concept without that device, they might not know much.
I mean, like that could get into like a whole like you could just go way off with that question. like what are humans without our tools, right? Like, but I mean, it's just like we are pretty well adapted in a lot of ways to the world we live in, which requires us to use certain tools, and we're really good at using those tools. Like, as a consequence, we're not so good at using other tools because nobody can be good at everything.
Yeah, that's true. So I guess based off of that one, because this one I kind of look at hard, and I haven't got an answer, but I guess your thoughts of, so if we were to have to flip, if we took basically one adult from living in, let's say, Georgia, and one of these people from indigenous tribes, including the language barrier, and we flipped them for maybe a week, who do you think would actually survive better? Or maybe a month? Be able to adapt actually better, I guess would be a better thing. Word.
I mean, like, presuming you're like, you know, particular like guy from Brazil doesn't die of like measles or some preventable illness.
Oh yeah, well, that's true too.
That would be like in a kind of a serious danger. I don't know. Like, I mean, the thing is, of course, is that like I think they'd both do okay because these are, of course, like uncontacted tribes. We're not talking about like just random people living in the jungle alone, but they've got like, you know, families, societies, like, you know, they have a whole system of support, and that's how they survive. That's how anybody survives, is like kind of like, you know, like having some kinds of connections. So I think they both do okay. I feel like a modern person living in modern society would probably be able to do okay in a very like technologically simple society. The person from the simple society, from the uncontacted group, would probably be just really bewildered by a lot of the stuff they run into in a modern setting. Like, they'd get some stuff really easily. Like, you know, a lot of the basic tools and stuff are the same, you know, like things like houses and stuff. That's all the same. But there's a lot of extra stuff that we've kind of added on. I think it would really be a very like shocking experience. But on the other hand, like from what little I know about people who have been sort of exposed, like there are people who have been recently contacted, like groups who were uncontacted, but for whatever reason sort of came into greater contact with society. They have suffered a lot for the reasons we talked about in terms of being like economically exploited, but they seem to have picked up modern technology pretty quickly. So I think given a longer period of time, like months or years, I think they adapt pretty well. I'm not sure I could really come down with one or the other
Well,
to answer your question.
yeah. No, I mean, I think a lot of these questions basically, I don't know if there is a right or wrong answer per se. It's more of just like we can see the pros and I guess cons per se. And it's also to say, as we're talking about how that simplistic technology and adaptation, these people are no way should be ever looked at as savages or anything, because they actually, as you said, have society, like an actual society. They have they're in tribes, they have families and everything else. They know what they're doing. They are very well adapted and everything. So I think that seems to be, at least what I saw, a very big misconception of these people. Since they lack modern technology, they're just savages living in the woods or the forest per se.
It's a bit of like a really high level thing, but I think I'm right about this. I'm not sure, but like stuff like smelting metal to make alloys, which is so critical to like all of modern society and society for in major civilizations for thousands of years. That only got invented by people maybe like 2 or 3 times total ever, as far as we know. And then it just got spread. So people who are basically the same as us, if you lived, for example, in a very remote region, like most of the Americas, which are cut off from the rest of the world for thousands of years, they just it's not a surprise that people didn't actually invent some technologies, because very few people ever invented them to begin with. And in the absence of that, they just, they used what they had, and they did pretty well with what they had. So, for the most part, people invent new stuff when they were kind of pushed into a situation where they have to develop.
Oh yeah,
is what I'd say. So,
yeah, I mean, they have a whole entire thing of the space race and science basically being pushed through this whole race that basically pushed progress through science and new technology.
Yeah. So if you don't have that kind of stuff going on, it's not really that surprising that people who are basically normal humans would just be like, this works for us, and we're going to keep doing it this way because it works for us.
It's funny because you said all that, and first thing that came to mind, so you're saying about 90% of the population just ride the coattails off of maybe 10% of inventors.
More like even fewer. I don't know.
Yeah, that was probably a general number. It was a lot higher, probably more like 3%, but we could be nice. You never know. So as we're talking about the technology limit things, you mentioned anthropology. Before we get into that, I want to go into basically these people are like a geneticist and evolutionary biologist dream, because their DNA is so unique and so unstudied, is that, like we said before, they can die from a handshake or somebody coughing or even breathing on them, but they've been living in the forest without modern medicine for who knows, hundreds of years. And there's some people that argue that they literally might hold, while they may die of the flu or measles, they may actually hold the key to fighting diseases and curing cancer per se.
I mean, it's definitely kind of an interesting possibility. The trick is just you don't really know just how isolated a group of people is. Right. You mentioned before, some of these uncontacted peoples are only uncontacted in the recent historical past.
Yes, this is also true.
So they may have had a lot more interaction with other groups. They may have not even existed as a group before a few hundred years ago. So in that kind of case, their genes might be pretty similar to the other people in the same basic region. They'd obviously be somewhat distinct because they've been isolated for a couple of centuries now, maybe more, maybe longer. But it's hard to say unless you actually have people's blood to test.
Right.
So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's on the other hand, there's people who are more contacted who are still really distinctive just because of how long they've lived in one location. So if you can have contact, but if your people aren't really moving and they're not marrying other groups of people, then you can still have a really strange kind of genetic background.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess that's the whole concept of genetic drift and basically, when we say genetic drift, it's basically the flow of genes from one population to another.
Mhm.
And he's basically referring to, like in America, we have the Kentucky blue people per se, and a lot of the Amish populations have this problem with this. A lot of inbreds, so that you're not getting this whole like outside world population genes, and so then you kind of end up running into this bottleneck where mutations start occurring in your DNA, and then you become more successful to where you have Kentucky blue people. For those of you who've never seen pictures of that, Google them. It's quite interesting. But the same concept here, but on a different scale of living in the forest, per se. I guess the cool thing about that is, like, because I guess why I find it fascinating with the geneticists and why they kind of been wanting to study them as well, because just that because they live in a lot, because I mean, as much as we talk about like the Kentucky blue people and the Amish people, they still live in like nice houses. They can still they have like actual infrastructure of like roads per se that are made from concrete and some technology. And then even if they need to access immediately to medicine, if there's something comes up. Whereas these people literally live in like a rainforest, probably in a hut of some sort with just mud, not like a wood that's probably not like, been primed or cut to look, like to health standards, I guess. And they've still been able to survive. And also just the fact of living in the forest, there's so much more diversity as far as like plants and animals, and like a lot more dangers in that way versus I live on a farm in like the middle of Kansas.
Yeah, they'd definitely be interesting to like see like people talk about like, all sorts of disease or like epigenetic problems caused by modern like industry, all the chemicals we've been using for a couple of centuries now going on. What are people who've been so isolated from that, like in terms of their like health biology? And they would also probably like, there's a good chance that they would know different kinds of approaches to medicine that might be things we haven't seen before that could turn out to be really useful. So all of that is pretty interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if they expect like the Sean Connery movie where he basically goes to Amazon, finds a cure for cancer from a shaman, and then ends up losing it. But I mean, something of that effect they can see if some in a smaller, more realistic platform of that happening. I had another point. I forgot what it was. Damn it. It was something good, and I forgot because I thought of Sean Connery. I don't know, fighting diseases. Oh, yes, sorry. There we go. And it was funny because it basically kind of leads to when I was an undergrad and I was taking kind of like cellular development and everything. And my teacher always said it was more of a joke, but it kind of made a sense of people that have kids. The first thing you want to do with your kids is basically take them on a trip and run them through the Amazon so they get exposed to as much stuff as possible so their bodies can build these antibodies. And obviously it's a joke and you probably end up being a lot more detriment, but there is some underlying thing of like the more you're exposed to as a younger child, the more antibodies you can build up.
Though, like, I'd actually say, if you really wanted somebody to build up strong antibodies to all sorts of diseases, you'd take them to the middle of it, like a city. Because nothing breeds like infectious disease like having a lot of people in a relatively small place with like livestock and other animals around, all interacting with each other. When one thing that a lot of European colonists, when they were first coming to the Americas, 16th century and stuff, remarked on was how healthy the Indian population seemed to a lot of them. Because they'd been living in relatively small communities, most of them. Even the largest, there were some really large cities in places like Mexico, but even then they weren't as crowded and they had less livestock than people in Europe. And so they just had fewer diseases. So people who had grown up in Europe had grown up with all of these sicknesses, and it really badly affected their health. A lot of them suffered long-term health effects if they lived to adulthood. But they also had the antibodies against, smallpox, measles, all of that kind of sickness. People in the Americas, a lot fewer infectious diseases. So they seemed really healthy. But then when things like measles and smallpox started to spread throughout the continent, they just died in huge numbers.
Right. So basically, it's basically the other side of the coin of either you live with either nature and all of the dangers of nature and diseases they produce versus actually living in cities and people produce almost the same.
Like, and I mean, in the past, I think it was probably the worst of both worlds. Because
yeah, I believe that's true.
Before antibiotics and anything.
Before even penicillin. Mm-hmm. Which I guess the penicillin guy decided he was actually going to try to make money off of it. I guess I'd wonder where we'd be at now instead of giving it to everybody. It's funny because I know it's probably a little side note, but just that whole, because he basically didn't want to patent this whole thing so that everybody could have penicillin. It could be easily accessible to everybody. Yet I just can see if something like that happens in like this day and age, I just don't know if somebody would actually do that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it might be because of the degree to which like people talk about this. We've kind of forgotten what it was like for people.
That is very true.
To die so easily of all sorts of sickness. And for someone at like for people even a few generations ago, it would have seemed, I think, a lot more obvious. You have to make this available to everybody because everybody knows somebody who's lost like children or family members to measles or scarlet fever or something like that. So
yeah, it's crazy to think about that because we are definitely living in America. It's very spoiled in this whole thing. Like, I mean, people in, I believe it was India, I mean, they, up until 2011, they were still experiencing polio.
Yeah.
And it's like us, and then even like my parents, they don't know what, I mean, they know what polio is, but they weren't going through the experience of people dying all the time with even just that. So that is crazy to think about. So moving on from the science, probably go more into your realm of anthropology and cultural studies, which I'm assuming you would also say is one of the dreams, if you're one of that, to be able to study these people.
I guess
or fascination per se.
Yeah, for my feeling, it's kind of a dream in the sense that it wouldn't be really ever possible because you can't like send somebody in to do like the like the cliche anthropologist thing where like you live with in somebody's house and like follow them around with a clipboard and ask them questions. Like you can't do that with a group of 30 to 50 people without really altering the dynamics of the community, because everybody knows, like, even if you brought no like modern technology with you and could somehow perfectly like engage with the people you were trying to study, they'd know that you were there and that you're an outsider. And in a larger community, you might have a better chance of kind of blending in. But in a very small community, the anthropologist is going to become something that changes community dynamics. And that's like the criticism people have leveled against anthropologists who've studied some not uncontacted groups, but very small, like indigenous communities, is that what they're reporting on is not what the group is actually like. It's what the group is like with an anthropologist around. So you just like, you couldn't really, it would be like incredibly fascinating to know about people who have been deliberately keeping themselves away from other people for hundreds of years. But you could really like learn a lot about a group of people who've been trying to hide themselves from the rest of the world for maybe a couple of hundred years now. But the only way to find that out would be to totally change the facts on the ground of those people. And then that's not exactly what you went in wanting to know about to begin with.
So it leads to two things that I think about when you say that. One, I think about NASA when they're trying to look at these ice lakes that are underneath the Arctic, and they want to like get samples, but they don't want to disturb it, and so they're trying to basically just looking at this like we can't do anything because we know once we enter that we are disturbing that area. So it's like an oxymoron, or I guess not really an oxymoron, but I can't even think of it. There we go. Thank you so much. Couldn't think of the word. I was like, that's not the right word. And the other part of I guess be interesting. Should we? What about? I know probably obviously we'll talk about a little, I guess, moral and ethics, because this is a very ethical thing. Is what about, should we use like drones or like even cameras to set up to watch? I guess to watch and study these people then.
I mean, like,
or is that even possible?
I mean, it sounds like it would probably be possible. You'd probably lose a lot of drones because I'm pretty sure that most such people are very good shots. Like, on the other hand, like, even flying a drone over somebody's house, it's something you'd do to your neighbor. And your neighbor would know what was going on. Like, you know, if some like weird flying thing shows up over your house that you've never seen before, like, that's like, it's kind of it's like, what's that movie? The Gods Must Be Crazy? Like, where the guy finds the Coke bottle and it throws their like small tribal society into disarray because what is this? Like, what is it for? What's its purpose? That's kind of a cliche, but it is kind of a just fundamentally rude thing to do to somebody.
Right.
Like, so you don't want to, you don't want to, like, you know, you may never meet these people, but you don't want to like treat them badly. Correct. At the same time. So,
especially if a lot of them, it seems like, have actually, like, I guess, gone into deeper in the forest and have voluntarily tried to remain isolated because they've been treated so badly.
Yeah.
And so I guess one thing before we, I guess, get into some like ethical questions or anything, do you think we'll ever be able to find a language barrier, if there ever is, or even break communication, or be able to even study their language or communicate with some of these people? I mean, I know they have a little bit, they kind of use some side of translators per se and meet people, but I mean, I think, you think you'll be able to like get to the point where somebody from an outside world can literally walk up on like the beach and like actually have a conversation per se, or even if it's just like by body language and not even actual language or even their own language?
I mean, like, they've tried that stuff.
Right.
Like, there's one group of people, like, we talked about these guys when we were coming up with the idea for this segment, but they're called the Sentinelese. They live on the Sentinel Islands, which are part of the Andaman Islands. They're like in the Indian Ocean, very remote, and they've just rejected contact with anybody. Yes. Every time a boat washes up, they shoot arrows at it. Like, they drive away anybody who comes near their island. They tried to bring in people from a nearby island who seemed to speak the same language or a similar language as them, from what people could tell. And those people tried to talk to the Sentinelese, and Sentinelese were like, no, we're, like, equally hostile to you. I'm not sure if they actually had a common language, but even if you can manage to speak to people, I know that in like Brazil, it's been the case that there are many groups who speak basically similar languages. Right. Some are contacted, some aren't. If they don't want to interact, like, they're just not going to interact. Like, doesn't matter if they can understand what you're saying or not. Like, it might shift their decision a little bit, but they might still decide they don't want to have anything to do with you. So just
leave me alone. That's all they want. I guess leads into the first question I want to ask, we should think. So we talked about scientists, and I mean, I guess some of the benefits of possibly, and obviously detriments of like contacting these people. Should we just be left alone? I know in a lot, I mean, overall, like, not studied, not anything. I know in some places that's like forbidden. They don't even allow you, like, even scientists to go in there. Should we give up all research of even trying to even know they exist?
I mean, my personal like thought would be probably, Because if somebody is doing the equivalent of having a giant no trespassing sign, and no matter how many times you like try to say hello to them, they shoot at you, then yeah, that they're sending a pretty clear signal they don't want to interact. And it seems like the basically right thing to do is to respect that.
Right.
It's probably okay, I think, to like try to monitor these kinds of groups passively. Like, and there's different ways people could go about doing it, you know, using things like drones from a distance to just try to get like head counts of people, or asking other neighboring groups of people who you do have contact with, have you seen the, you know, members of this group traveling around anywhere? Do you know how many of them there are? Like, trying to find out information about them is probably okay, but trying to actually like interact with them, I think, has to happen on their terms.
Which kind of leads to one of the, I guess, ethical questions was saying, and kind of more of obviously a hypothetical, especially when it comes to science, if they know something is very beneficial to people, like if they can figure out and deduce that like basically a cure to disease is within these people's like genetics, I mean, should they still study them, or should we respect in what, I guess, the common cause of like benefits of like, I guess, progressing science in other fields for the attempts of like anthropology and stuff versus leaving them alone? Because obviously from a general aspect, especially if you're a tourist or something, leave them alone. But I guess at what point do we draw the line?
I mean, it's like, obviously it was like, if there's some kind of like really like incredible edge case, like the cure for cancer, I feel like I'd have a hard time, like, that would become a very hard decision to make. But we have, like, you know, we've done stuff like in again, the pretty recent past, like the history of medicine hasn't always been particularly rosy in terms of like poor people and marginalized groups being experimented on without their knowledge.
The syphilis trials, and I believe it's syphilis, but they
yeah,
did a lot of STDs.
The Tuskegee experiment, and just all sorts of other things like that. So I don't think. I mean, I can imagine some situation where you could make an utilitarian argument, like, you know, these people's isolation is not worth the lives of thousands and thousands or millions of people, but that's just such a dangerous thing to hypothesize about unless you have clear evidence, you know, like, and even then, like, you would still, the question would be like, well, then what do you do? Like, do you forcibly try to integrate this group of people into society, or what? Like, is there a way to interact with them some, but still allow them to remain autonomous? How possible is that? It's hard to say.
Yeah, to be still like one person from the tribe and be like, this is a sacrifice off of this one person versus everybody. Yeah, no, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I know these are hard ethical questions for everybody out there. It's just something that's really to think about, and it's hard to think because you're like, because as bad as some of these medicine trials are, and if you ever go back and read like how we discovered a lot of things, they are pretty bad and deranged. But unfortunately, as much as we say that, there are been a lot of like modern advancements in medicine that have come from a lot of this stuff. So it does suck.
Yeah, and with groups of people who are really, there's a kind of a question where it's like, if this was a group of if it's a group of people living in like under the state government of any place, there's quite a lot that a government can do to people living within its jurisdiction, usually, to kind of make them do what they want, even within the limits of, say, like constitutional rights of any given country. But with these groups who are sort of outside officially of any kind of real jurisdiction, what do you do with them? How do you make like laws apply to them? Like, what's their status relative to everybody else? And why should it be protected? Exactly. That's kind of a like difficult question that people debate over.
Yeah, which kind of leads into the kind of next question I really kind of have is, should the government of these countries where they're located be spending money to help these people and funding these, especially if there maybe are other problems? And I know it comes up with obviously this, but it comes up even in America today with funding of things.
I don't think that they probably. My hunch is that they probably don't spend like the Brazilian agency, it's called FUNAI, I think is its name. I don't think that they can't possibly be spending that much of their money like on this.
I have to double check. I know they were in. I know their budget's been completely slashed for this. When I read this, I believe they had a high point of like $400 million down to like maybe like in the lower, like less than 100 million, I believe. But they had. So obviously they're not in the billions or trillions, but there was. I mean, there's still quite a like millions of dollars being spent on this. I'd have to relook at what they said, but I'm pretty sure it's only probably maybe in the maybe 30 million range now, compared to like maybe 400 million. But then again, I guess it also comes to the point of like, is it okay to spend 1 million on these people and that's okay? But what about if we spend 100 million on these people? And then also like, how much does it actually help?
I mean, I think like the approach that the people who have kind of taken on the role of defenders of uncontacted people have tended to say is like, we people living in kind of modern society have a responsibility to protect people who have remained uncontacted from our own bad influences. So providing vaccines and providing protection from things like loggers, criminals of various kinds. Like if somebody is trying to go kill them, we ought to stop them from doing that. On the other hand, I don't think anybody has like seriously considered like you say, we should also provide like uncontacted groups with other kinds of material benefits, because of course they're not really asking for those benefits.
Yeah, I was like, to make this clear, like they have not asked the governments of any of these countries for anything. It's more of like they just try to do it, like he said, to protect them and maybe give them pots and pans, like they give them a Tupperware set or something every now and then. I mean, that's about the extent of their tools that the technology tools are giving them.
Like it would be, I think it's mostly a matter of if a group like this doesn't want to interact, I think that it's still probably worth it and kind of ethically required, I'd say, to try and protect them from people who are trying to harm them. If those people are, by our standards, criminals, people trying to commit violent crimes, or even our own diseases and things like pollutants and stuff, anything like that, that seems like the right thing to do. So I think that a government should provide that. Besides that, though, it becomes a question of how much do they want to accept help? So if they don't want to, for example, receive vaccination, I'm not sure you can actually, force them to take it in that case. So again, it becomes a really like difficult issue of how much do you force people to accept your protection versus how much do you kind of allow them autonomy, which might like endanger them in some other way. So
overall, I think obviously there's still about 100 tribes or so left. They seem to be doing what they do every day and living. I mean, I know they face many problems, but obviously they're still surviving. And in some cases, some of the tribes are growing, at least to their best bet. So they're doing something right. Or at least obviously the societies are doing what is right for them. And at least the outside world is doing at least enough to where they're not like decimating them right off the bat.
I think people like these groups of people will probably be okay if they are, for the most part, like not harmed by outsiders.
Right.
It's other sort of modern humans who present the biggest like risk to like threat to them. And it's funny to me in a kind of a sad way, because again, if this was a group of people who could say who had the like, the right knowledge to put a sign out to say like, no trespassing, that would be something that I think more people would probably respect, though maybe not. Because there have been like what's the name of that group? There was, for example, in Indonesia, there was a group of people called the Penang, or Penang, I think. I can't remember if it's an N or an NG. They're not an uncontacted tribe, but they were sort of living as subsistence hunter-gatherers in the forest. And they took on the loggers in a very like publicized campaign.
Huh.
And a lot of them got killed for it,
Well.
unfortunately. But you know, they were trying to use the tools of the government and the media to actually say, please leave us alone. We live here, you know, and they were not totally successful. I think they had some success protecting their territory, but not perfect success. So it's not like groups of people in similar situations can't kind of like stake a claim and say to modern society, you know, we don't want what you're trying to force on us, and we want to be kind of left alone. But it's like whether or not it succeeds is very debatable. It's very uncertain. So
It's just also crazy when we think about this, and that their territory is a lot of like where country lines are and borders are today, literally because people just planted their flag there and said, "This is mine now."
I mean, like the Amazon, especially.
Yeah, I own this. I have a flag.
It's been part of the country of mostly Brazil and in some other countries, Bolivia, parts of Peru, for a long time. But for so much of that time, it was very little explored.
Yes.
Very little like industry, very little like penetration of modern economies and government and stuff. And that's why these people have remained uncontacted. And now that that's changing, that creates this big problem for them.
Yeah, because I think I've seen where basically even like in this whole rainforest and like all this undiscovered area, even using satellite and drone technology, I believe they still have not even mapped at least a good portion of some of those countries in South America.
I mean, like it's hard to map a place that's essentially a forest.
Yeah, because
swamp.
Because obviously people haven't been there, but I mean, if you can't even map it using like satellite technology, then you definitely know how dense and like how hard this is places to access.
So, in that case, then it just seems like I think we do sort of owe them like a degree of kind of hands-off protection or treatment, because they're not really different from us in terms of the fundamentals. They're people who just like want to live their lives and not be like threatened. And it just happens that because of their history, including being threatened so badly in the past, like that they've retreated from a lot of the rest of the world. So it seems like the right thing to do is probably to respect that decision.
I agree. I think it's fascinating that obviously even just to live out there, I think it'd be something that's cool. I mean, I guess I think about it some days because a lot of people are like, I hate my job. And it's like, well, these people don't even necessarily have jobs. They do things to help out and do necessity to live, but they don't have to. I mean, I don't know how much their actual economy is built per se, or even economics, but yeah.
Like, and like, there's plenty of people who live like still a fairly kind of subsistence kind of lifestyle in other parts of the world, but they know like that there's countries out there. They know that there's like, all sorts of different people.
Right.
They're aware of the larger world. These people, they know that there's other groups of humans, and they know that there's people who are probably like really strange, like by their lights, but they don't know who they are, and they don't really want to know. As far as they're concerned, you can stay away. So yeah. That's, I think, the thing that makes it so so kind of fascinating is like really deliberately avoiding knowing anything about these people around you besides, they're probably bad. That's, the decision you make, and then you kind of, you act on that and you stay away from like these strangers. Like that's a very different experience from just about anybody else in the world in the last like couple hundred years. And probably even before that. I do wonder though, like, what's it like for different groups of uncontacted people? Because they live in basically similar regions. So they probably have contact with each other.
From everything I read, they apparently do contact and even trade per se, and even go to war sometimes with other people of other contacted tribe, like this whole other, like, I guess, area of just different cities or tribes of people. Just
what happens when a group of people who are uncontacted, have remained uncontacted, have a relation to another group of people who are contacted? Like, do they find out more about like our society from the people in, this other group who they may be trading with or meeting in some capacity? Like, that's the thing that's interesting to me. Like,
yeah, I want to say they do, but I think what's also interesting is what are they actually told?
Yeah,
I mean, are these traded, like the people that you get this from this outside world? Are we painted in a nice, like, they're just other people from outside world, but they're kind and they give us stuff, but we leave us alone? Or they think we're the savages and just want to destroy them?
Like that's actually, that is like the thing that's most interesting to me is like, what is it like to learn about the world in that way? Because that's a thing that for most of the rest of the world hasn't had that experience in a long time. Like, learning about a new group of people through that kind of contact is something that especially in like Europe and Asia, where we've had lots and lots of, major cities and countries for thousands of years now, that experience is just, in the distant past for most groups of people. But for these people, this is how they are, like, encountering the world. And that's just really, like, it's so different. And yet I know, for a fact that it's something that people from our society went through that same experience at some point. Like, and so you wonder, what was this like? What was it like being in that kind of social relationship? I don't know.
I think the fun thing when we talk about history like this, especially on like where we go of like how long they've been around, I guess the fun thing I've always thought about history is, to define history is basically where you start. What is your starting point of history?
Like, it has a lot to do with probably when people are sort of like coming up with the kind of descriptions of not just their world, but also like the other people around them. Like, if they know that there's other groups of people, they have to categorize those groups of people. Like, who are these neighbors to the east, to the north? What are they like? Where did they come from? Are they friendly? Are they not friendly? And that's really, I think, where you start having like just history in general has a lot to do with that kind of categorizing the people that you're familiar with, or maybe the people you're not familiar with, that you just heard about from somebody. Like,
yeah, because it's funny because I get asked all the time by people like, well, is this animal native to here? Are they from like a different country? Is this plant native or non-native? That essentially means whether they came from like where we're at or where they're found at now. And I'm just kind of like, well, it depends on where you start your timeline. Because like horses, I believe back then were from the Americas, then they went out extinct and then brought back to the Americas. And so it depends on where you start your timeline. So I guess one more thing, I guess any final thoughts? I think we've covered pretty much quite a bit and asked quite a bit of questions, that's for sure.
Well, not really. Like you mentioned this, I guess, before, but like kind of the whole like sort of paradoxical thing about talking about uncontacted tribes is that by nature they're kind of hard to talk about. Like you don't know that much about them, because they don't want to be known very much about. So
I think we've done a pretty good job. Definitely found, obviously we talked about best we can, and I guess the one question that remains that I really want to know, that I guess you thought of, and it could be pretty simple, just kind of a yes or no. I mean, do you think we'll have I guess in the future, let's say these people last for a while and survive for a decade, do you think we have a better chance of meeting aliens and understanding them, or actually understanding these uncontacted tribes that live on our own planet?
Oh, definitely the people on our own planet. Like, I mean, though, it's funny though. I wonder if we might be in some ways well attuned to encountering aliens eventually, because there's a lot of different groups of humans, and some of us are really different from each other in terms of our culture and language and stuff like that. We're all still human, but people, have gone through these kinds of first contact experiences many, many, many times throughout history. So, we might be well prepared to encounter aliens in part because we've had so much experience encountering, each other in ways that seemed very strange to us. Unfortunately, most of the time when we've encountered strange other humans, we've tried to kill them.
Yes, that's also true. That's very true.
That could go really badly.
About that, we like to either it's food or we try to kill it. That's about how we start. So I guess that'd be about it for this. I guess to wrap up everything, as I said, I'm Matt from But Why the Podcast, and you can check out this and all of our other episodes at our website at butwhythepodcast.com. You can also find us on pretty much any basically podcast app, such as iTunes, iHeartRadio, which apparently we are on, Stitcher, Google Play, and etc. And you can also find, if you like to communicate or discuss any of these topics or any of our other episodes, you can find us on Twitter at butwhythopc or Facebook at facebook.com/butwhythopc, or you can email us at info@butwhythopodcast.com. And Brice, where can everybody find you if you'd like to be found, or if you'd like to stay voluntarily isolated?
I will choose to remain isolated, and I will throw spears at anyone who tries to come by my house.
That is very fair. Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can come up with something else, and we can get you back on here at some time, so people can know as a random guy in a silhouette, like on a conspiracy show.
Yes. I eagerly await the next random topic of discussion.
All right. Well, thanks everybody, and bye-bye.
Take care.